What if I told you that the world has almost ended several times, and the only reason you're here listening to this is because seven American presidents made exactly the right call at exactly the right moment? Not the most popular calls, not the easiest calls, just the right ones. We're talking about presidents who faced actual, literal apocalypse scenarios: nuclear annihilation, the collapse of democracy, totalitarian empires conquering the free world, civil war that would have shattered the only multiracial democracy on earth, and somehow, through a combination of wisdom, luck, stubbornness, and occasionally just refusing to listen to their generals, they pulled humanity back from the edge. So before we drift off tonight, if you enjoy falling asleep to stories about how we barely survived the 20th century, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Your algorithm will thank you, and so will I. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about the seven presidents who saved the world, starting with a haberdasher from Missouri who ended up holding the sun in his hands. Harry S. Truman, the man who held the sun in his hands. All right, settle in, get comfortable, because we're about to talk about a haberdasher from Missouri who ended up making the most consequential decision in human history and somehow still managed to go home at night and play the piano like nothing happened. Harry S. Truman. No period after the S, by the way, because the S doesn't stand for anything. His parents couldn't decide between his two grandfathers' names, Solomon and Shippe, so they just gave up and went with the letter. Which is exactly the kind of absurd detail that makes you realize this man's entire life was a series of unlikely events stacked on top of each other like a Jenga tower made of pure historical chaos. Picture this. It's April of 1945. You're the Vice President of the United States. You've been in the job for exactly 82 days. You spend most of your time presiding over the Senate, which is about as exciting as watching paint dry in a beige room. You're not in the loop on anything important. The president, Franklin Roosevelt, barely talks to you. You're essentially the political equivalent of that person at work who gets invited to meetings but never gets the agenda beforehand. Then, on April 12th, you get summoned to the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt puts her hand on your shoulder and says, "Harry, the president is dead." And just like that, you're the president of the United States during World War II, with absolutely no briefing on the most significant military secret in human history. That's when they told him about the atomic bomb. Imagine finding out that your country has been secretly building a weapon that can vaporize an entire city, and by the way, you now have to decide whether to use it. It's like being handed the keys to a spaceship when you've never even driven a car. Except the spaceship can end the world, and also you have about 4 months to figure out what to do with it. So let's talk about what Truman was facing in the summer of 1945. The war in Europe was over, Hitler was dead, but Japan was still fighting, and they were fighting with the kind of desperate ferocity that comes from a military culture that considered surrender worse than death. The Battle of Okinawa had just ended, and it had been an absolute nightmare. 12,000 American deaths, over 100,000 Japanese military deaths, somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian deaths, depending on which estimate you believe. And that was just one island. The military planners were drawing up invasion plans for the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, they called it, which is the kind of cheerful name that really inspires confidence. The estimates for casualties ranged wildly, but the most commonly cited figure was around 1 million Allied casualties, with Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially reaching into the millions. Some historians argue these numbers were inflated. Others say they were conservative. But here's what matters. Truman believed them. He had another option on the table, a weapon that had been successfully tested in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, a weapon that created a flash of light visible for over 200 miles, a weapon that turned sand into glass and made hardened scientists quote Hindu scripture about becoming death, destroyer of worlds. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. 70,000 people died instantly. The number would climb to over 140,000 within months from injuries and radiation. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another 70,000 dead, eventually rising to around 80,000. These are the kind of numbers that should keep you awake at night. But we're trying to help you sleep, so let's think about what those numbers meant in context. Because here's the thing about moral calculations in wartime, they're all horrifying. Every option on Truman's desk involved massive death. The invasion would have killed more people, almost certainly, but those deaths would have been distributed differently, experienced differently, mourned differently. Truman made the call. Japan surrendered on August 15th. World War II was over. The most devastating conflict in human history, which had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, just stopped. And Truman went back to the White House and probably had a bourbon, because that's what you do when you've just ended a war by unleashing the fundamental forces of the universe on two cities. But here's where it gets interesting, in that quiet 3 a.m. kind of way. Because Truman didn't just end World War II, he immediately had to start thinking about what came next. And what came next was the Soviet Union looking very comfortable in Eastern Europe and starting to make eyes at Western Europe, like a person at a buffet who's already filled one plate and is eyeing a second. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March of 1947 to a joint session of Congress. The basic idea: the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, which sounds very noble and also conveniently vague. But what it meant in practice was that America was going to actively push back against Soviet expansion. Greece and Turkey were the immediate beneficiaries. Greece was in the middle of a civil war between the government and communist insurgents, backed by Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria. Turkey was facing pressure from the Soviets, who wanted control of the Turkish Straits, because of course they did. Everyone always wants control of strategic waterways. It's like the geopolitical version of Monopoly, except instead of collecting $200 when you pass go, you get the ability to blockade shipping lanes. Truman asked Congress for $400 million to help these countries. Congress gave it to him. Greece stayed democratic. Turkey stayed independent. The Soviets learned that the United States wasn't going back to isolationism, which had been their fondest hope. Then came the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall, because Truman was smart enough to know that putting his own name on it would make it harder to sell to Republicans in Congress. The official name was the European Recovery Program, which sounds like a very boring seminar you'd be forced to attend at a corporate retreat, but what it actually was the largest aid package in human history at that point. $13 billion. That's about $115 billion in today's money, which is the kind of sum that makes you dizzy if you think about it too long. The money went to rebuild Western Europe, which was still largely rubble and desperation in 1947. Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, 16 countries total received aid. And here's the brilliant part. The plan wasn't just about charity or even just about stopping communism. It was about creating an interconnected economic system that would make another European war virtually impossible. You can't easily go to war with a country when your economies are deeply intertwined and you both depend on the same supply chains. It's enlightened self-interest dressed up as generosity, and it worked spectacularly. The communist parties in France and Italy, which had been genuinely popular and genuinely powerful in the immediate post-war years, started losing ground. People had food, hope. Turns out it's harder to sell revolution when the Marshall Plan is rebuilding your factory and the breadlines are getting shorter. Western Europe stabilized. The Soviet Union was contained. The stage was set for the Cold War, which, yes, was tense and scary, and nearly ended the world a few times, but still beat the alternative of World War III starting in 1948. Oh, and while he was doing all of this, Truman also integrated the military. Executive Order 9981, signed on July 26, 1948. It didn't immediately desegregate the armed forces, but it started the process, and by the time the Korean War rolled around, integrated units were fighting together. This was not a popular decision, particularly in the South, and it cost Truman politically. He did it anyway because apparently saving the world and fundamentally reshaping the global order wasn't enough for one presidency. He also needed to begin dismantling American apartheid. The thing about Truman is that he was consistently underestimated. He looked like a bank clerk, he sounded like a county commissioner, he wore thick glasses and played the piano for fun, and had the charisma of a particularly earnest accountant. But the man had titanium running through his spine where most people have cartilage. He fired Douglas MacArthur, one of the most popular generals in American history, in the middle of the Korean War, because MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China and possibly use nuclear weapons. Truman said no. MacArthur publicly disagreed, and Truman fired him. The president's approval rating dropped to 22%. He did it anyway, because civilian control of the military matters, and also because starting World War III with China and the Soviet Union seemed like a bad idea, even if General MacArthur's ego was very invested in it. When Truman left office in 1953, he was deeply unpopular. His approval ratings were in the basement. People thought he was too aggressive on civil rights, too soft on communism, too willing to fight in Korea. Not willing enough to fight in Korea, depending on who you asked. He went back to Independence, Missouri, and lived a quiet life. He didn't write a best-selling memoir. He didn't cash in on the lecture circuit in any major way. He drove himself to the drugstore and bought his own stamps at the post office and lived in the same house he'd lived in before he became president. And slowly, over the decades, historians started to realize what he'd done. He'd ended the worst war in history. He'd rebuilt Europe from ashes. He had contained Soviet expansion at the exact moment when it could have swallowed the continent. He had set the precedent that nuclear weapons were not just another tool in the arsenal. They were different, special, terrible, to be used only in the most extreme circumstances. He'd integrated the military and started the long, brutal process of making America live up to its own ideals. Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher from Missouri with the fake middle initial, saved Western civilization in his spare time, and then went home and played the piano like it was no big deal. Which brings us to the question, what makes someone capable of that? What turns a person into someone who can authorize the use of nuclear weapons, rebuild a continent, stare down Stalin, and still sleep at night? Maybe it's the same quality that makes you a good president in the first place. The ability to make impossible choices with incomplete information and then live with the consequences. The capacity to act when action is required, even when every option is terrible. The wisdom to know that being popular is less important than being right, even if history takes 50 years to figure out which is which. Truman made the biggest calls in human history, and most of them turned out to be correct. He saved more lives than any single person in the 20th century, if you count both the invasion of Japan that didn't happen and the communist takeover of Europe that didn't happen. And he did it all while looking like the guy who does your taxes and probably gives you sensible advice about retirement accounts. Sleep on that tonight. Dream of a world where the most important decisions are made by people who look utterly ordinary and turn out to be utterly extraordinary when the moment demands it. It's a comforting thought in its own strange way. But, of course, Truman wasn't the first president to save the world by making a choice that seemed small at the time but echoed through centuries. George Washington, the man who could have been king. You know what's harder than ending a war or stopping an empire? Giving up power when you don't have to. Let's talk about George Washington, who did something so unprecedented, so utterly contrary to every pattern in human history, that when King George III heard about it, he reportedly said it would make Washington the greatest man in the world. Here's what you need to understand about 1783. The Revolutionary War is over. America has won somehow against all reasonable odds. The British have gone home. The Treaty of Paris is signed. And George Washington is standing there as the commander of the Continental Army, which is the most powerful military force in the new nation, and also the only institution that actually functions with any degree of competence. Congress? Joke. Couldn't raise taxes, couldn't pay debts, couldn't enforce laws. The Articles of Confederation made the federal government about as effective as a chocolate teapot. The states were squabbling with each other like siblings fighting over who gets the front seat. The economy was in shambles. There was talk of breaking up into separate confederacies, northern and southern, maybe 3 or 4 different countries where there used to be 13 colonies, and Washington had the army. You know what happens in literally every other situation in human history when a victorious general has an army and the civilian government is weak. The general becomes a dictator. That's it. That's the pattern. Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, every military strongman in every revolution that's ever happened. The pattern is so consistent it might as well be a law of physics. Washington's own officers practically begged him to do it. In 1783, there was a conspiracy among Continental Army officers called the Newburgh Conspiracy. They wanted Washington to either become king or lead a military coup against Congress because Congress couldn't pay them. These were Washington's most loyal officers, men who had fought with him for 8 years, and they were ready to overthrow the government they had just fought to create. Washington shut it down. He gave a speech to the officers where he pulled out a letter from a congressman and then fumbled with his glasses, saying, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country," which is exactly the kind of move that makes grown men weep. He told them no coup, no dictatorship. They would respect civilian authority even when civilian authority was being ridiculous. Then, on December 23rd, 1783, Washington went to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting, and he resigned his commission. He gave up command of the army. He went home to Mount Vernon to be a farmer. He didn't have to. There was no mechanism to make him. He just did it. The Congress was shocked. The nation was shocked. The world was shocked. This wasn't how power worked. Power was something you grabbed and held onto with both hands until someone pried your cold, dead fingers off it. Power wasn't something you returned like a library book because your checkout period was over. But Washington did it anyway because he understood something that most people in history have failed to grasp. Republics die when generals become kings. He went back to Mount Vernon and planted trees, actual trees. He experimented with crop rotation. He built a distillery that produced 11,000 gallons of whiskey a year, which is honestly an impressive detail that doesn't get mentioned enough. The man who could have been king went home and became a farmer and a whiskey maker because he believed in the idea of America more than he believed in his own greatness. Of course, they dragged him back out of retirement 6 years later to be the first president, because the Articles of Confederation had failed exactly as badly as everyone predicted, and they needed someone universally respected to make the new Constitution work. And Washington said yes, because duty apparently never sleeps, but he spent the entire time looking for the exit. 8 years as president. 2 terms. He could have stayed longer. There was no constitutional limit yet. He was unanimously elected twice. He could have died in office and been mourned as the eternal father of the nation. Instead, in 1796, he published his farewell address and went home, again. And just like that, he established the two-term tradition that every president followed until Franklin Roosevelt decided he was special, and which became constitutional law after FDR died because everyone realized Washington had been right all along. Think about what Washington created with that simple act of stepping down. He proved that republics could work, that you could have elections and peaceful transfers of power and a rotation of leadership without everything collapsing into chaos or tyranny. Every democracy that exists today, every peaceful election, every time power changes hands without violence, it all traces back to Washington's decision to go home and plant trees. Rome couldn't do it. The Roman Republic collapsed into civil war and then empire because too many generals decided they should be dictators. France couldn't do it. The French Revolution devolved into the Terror, and then Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Russia couldn't do it. The Bolsheviks promised democracy and delivered Stalin. It's hard. It's phenomenally hard. The default setting for human societies is for power to concentrate in the hands of whoever has the biggest army and the fewest scruples. Washington changed that default. For America first, and then as an example for everyone else. But let's talk about the other thing Washington did that probably saved the Republic. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Western Pennsylvania farmers were mad about a tax on whiskey. They'd been turning their grain into whiskey because whiskey was easier to transport over the mountains than grain, and also because whiskey was basically currency on the frontier. The federal government, desperate for revenue, slapped a tax on it. The farmers said no. They started tar and feathering tax collectors, which was the 18th century equivalent of very angry Yelp reviews, except with actual physical violence. This was a test. The new federal government had never enforced its authority over citizens who really, genuinely didn't want to comply. If Washington backed down, it would set the precedent that the government could be defied with impunity. If he came down too hard, it would make the federal government look like a tyrant and potentially spark a bigger rebellion. Washington activated 13,000 militiamen. He personally led them into western Pennsylvania, which made him the only sitting president to lead troops in the field, a record that still stands. The rebels saw the army coming and decided that maybe they didn't want to fight the guy who'd beaten the British Empire after all. The rebellion collapsed. Washington arrested about 20 people, pardoned most of them, and went back to Philadelphia. Firm but restrained. That was the message. The federal government would enforce the law, but it wouldn't crush dissent with overwhelming brutality. It would use exactly as much force as necessary and then stop, which again sounds obvious now, but wasn't obvious then. Governments tended to either ignore rebellions until they spiraled out of control or crush them so thoroughly that they created martyrs and resentment. Washington threaded the needle perfectly. He showed that federal authority was real, but he also showed that it could be exercised with restraint and mercy. The United States wasn't going to become a military dictatorship, but it also wasn't going to collapse into anarchy every time someone didn't want to pay their taxes. Now, here's another thing Washington did that doesn't get enough credit. He kept America out of a war it absolutely could not afford to fight. 1793. France and Britain are at war again. Because France and Britain being at war is basically the default setting of European politics in the 18th century. France is now a republic, sort of, in that chaotic, blood-soaked way that the French Revolution was a republic before it became a dictatorship. They want American support. We have a treaty with them from the Revolutionary War, after all. They helped us, now we should help them. Britain, meanwhile, is still Britain. Still powerful, still controlling the seas, still perfectly capable of strangling American trade and possibly invading again if they feel like it. And Washington looked at this situation and said, absolutely not. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in April of 1793. America would trade with both sides and fight for neither. This made almost everyone angry. The Federalists thought he was too soft on Britain. The Democratic Republicans thought he was betraying France and the cause of Republican liberty. Washington didn't care. He knew that America in 1793 was barely holding together, that the federal government was still figuring out how to collect taxes and deliver mail, and that getting involved in a European war would be suicide. He was right. If America had joined France, Britain would have blockaded American ports and probably invaded. If America had sided with Britain, France's privateers would have destroyed American shipping, and the Democratic Republicans might have led a revolt. By staying neutral, Washington gave the young nation time to grow, to stabilize, to become strong enough that it could eventually handle foreign conflicts without collapsing. This is the kind of world saving that happens in slow motion, the kind you don't notice until decades later when you realize that the country is still here and still functioning. Washington saved America by being boring and cautious when everyone wanted him to be bold and dramatic. And then there's his farewell address, published in September of 1796, though he never actually delivered it as a speech. He just had it printed in newspapers, because Washington understood that the written word lasted longer than spoken passion. In it, he warned against permanent foreign alliances. He warned against the rise of political parties and factionalism. He warned against sectionalism and regional loyalties trumping national unity. He basically predicted every problem that would plague American politics for the next 2.5 centuries and politely asked everyone to avoid them. Did anyone listen? Of course not. Political parties formed immediately. Foreign entanglements became constant. Sectionalism led to a civil war 65 years later. But the farewell address remained as a touchstone, a reminder of what the founder had wanted, a standard to measure against even when everyone was failing to meet it. Washington died in December of 1799 at his beloved Mount Vernon, probably from a throat infection that his doctors made worse by bleeding him. His last words were reportedly, "'Tis well," which is the most George Washington thing possible. No drama, no grand pronouncements, just a quiet acknowledgement that it was time to go. He'd saved the world by being exactly what the world needed when it needed it. A general who wouldn't be king, a president who wouldn't be emperor, a leader who understood that the greatest power is the power to say no to power itself. These seem like small things, maybe, in the grand scheme of world saving. He didn't end a war with nuclear weapons. He didn't rebuild a continent with foreign aid. But here's the thing. Washington created the foundation that made everything else possible. Without the precedent of peaceful transfers of power, without the establishment of federal authority that was firm but not tyrannical, without the example of a leader who voluntarily relinquished power, none of the rest of American democracy works. Every president who came after Washington inherited his choice. They inherited a system where power was temporary, where leadership was a service, not a crown, where the military answered to civilians, where force was a last resort, not a first instinct. Truman could make the decision to use nuclear weapons and then step down after one elected term because Washington had shown that stepping down was an option. Lincoln could fight a civil war to preserve the Union because Washington had created a Union worth preserving. Every president who has ever faced a crisis and then handed power to their successor is standing on Washington's shoulders, whether they know it or not. Washington saved the world by proving that republics could survive, that people could govern themselves without kings or dictators or generals for life, that power could be shared and transferred and restrained. In 1783 and 1796, he set humanity on a different path, not the path of empires and strongmen, but the path of democracy and self-governance. And he did it by doing something that should have been impossible. He said no to power. Think about that as you drift off. Think about a world where the most important thing someone can do is refuse to be important, where the greatest act of leadership is knowing when to stop leading. where the man who could have been king chose to be a citizen instead, and in doing so, saved us all from ourselves. That's the kind of paradox that makes history beautiful, in a slow, sleepy, 3 in the morning kind of way. But giving up power is only half the battle. Sometimes saving the world means keeping it, using it, wielding it at exactly the right moment to prevent catastrophe. Abraham Lincoln, the man who held a nation together with his bare hands, Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, which sounds like a folksy detail, but was actually just poverty. His mother died when he was 9. His father was illiterate. Lincoln taught himself to read by candlelight, walked miles to borrow books, and somehow turned himself into one of the most skilled writers and speakers in American history. It's the kind of bootstrap story that sounds too perfect to be true, except it is true, and it still doesn't prepare you for what came next. By 1860, Lincoln was a moderately successful lawyer and former one-term congressman who'd lost 2 Senate races. Not exactly a resume that screams savior of democracy, but the Republican Party nominated him anyway, mostly because he was from Illinois and hadn't made as many enemies as the other candidates. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, split into northern and southern factions who nominated different candidates, which meant Lincoln won with less than 40% of the popular vote. The South looked at this tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois who'd won without carrying a single southern state, and they decided that was it. The Union was over. Time to leave. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, before Lincoln even took office. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed by February of 1861. They formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as their president, and started seizing federal forts and arsenals. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, 7 states had already left, and the federal government had done essentially nothing about it. Lincoln's predecessor, James Buchanan, had spent his final months in office wringing his hands and insisting that secession was illegal, but also that he had no power to stop it, which is the kind of constitutional interpretation that's only useful if you're trying to avoid responsibility for everything. So Lincoln inherited a country that was actively dissolving, a military that was tiny and scattered, a treasury that was nearly empty, and a capital city that was surrounded by slave states and might be attacked at any moment. Also, he had no executive experience whatsoever. His entire political career had been legislative. He'd never run anything larger than a law office. And then Fort Sumter happened. April 12th, 1861. Confederate forces in Charleston, South Carolina, opened fire on the federal fort in the harbor. The fort surrendered after 34 hours of bombardment. Nobody died in the actual battle, which is the kind of detail that makes the Civil War seem almost polite at first, before you remember that 620,000 people would die over the next 4 years. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina immediately seceded and joined the Confederacy. Now there were 11 Confederate states, and the capital of the Confederacy was Richmond, Virginia, about 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. The first major battle was Bull Run in July of 1861. The Union Army marched out to crush the rebellion, followed by spectators from Washington who brought picnic baskets to watch the battle. The Confederates won. The Union Army broke and ran. The spectators ran too. It was a humiliating disaster that made it very clear this war wasn't going to be over quickly. Lincoln had to figure out how to win a war against people who knew the terrain, believed deeply in their cause, and had some of the best military officers in the country. Robert E. Lee had been offered command of the Union Army and had turned it down to fight for Virginia. Stonewall Jackson was a tactical genius. The Confederate Army was smaller but often better led. And Lincoln had to do all this while keeping the border states, the slave states that hadn't seceded, in the Union. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri were all slave states that could have joined the Confederacy. If Maryland had seceded, Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded. If Kentucky had seceded, the Ohio River would have been the Confederate border. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, arrested secessionists, and generally did things that would have been considered tyrannical in peacetime, all to keep those states from leaving. He also had to deal with his own generals, who ranged from incompetent to actively treasonous. George McClellan, the general he appointed to lead the Army of the Potomac, was brilliant at organizing troops and terrible at actually fighting. He'd train a massive army, march it toward Richmond, and then find reasons not to attack. Lincoln kept firing generals and appointing new ones, hoping to find someone who would actually fight. Meanwhile, the question of slavery was lurking under everything. Lincoln personally hated slavery, he'd said so many times. But he also believed his primary duty as president was to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Early in the war, he insisted that the war was about preserving the United States, not about ending slavery. When generals like John C. Fremont tried to free slaves in their military districts, Lincoln overruled them because he was worried about losing the border states. But by 1862, Lincoln had realized that slavery and the war were inseparable. The Confederacy's economy ran on slave labor. Slaves were growing food, building fortifications, working in factories. If Lincoln could turn the war into a war against slavery, he could undermine the Confederate economy and also make it impossible for Britain and France to support the Confederacy. Since both countries had abolished slavery and their populations wouldn't support a pro-slavery intervention. So, on September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. As of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in states still in rebellion would be declared free. Notice what that meant. It didn't free slaves in the border states because Lincoln still needed those states in the Union. It didn't free slaves in areas the Union had already captured. It only freed slaves in areas still controlled by the Confederacy, which meant Lincoln was declaring freedom for people he had no power to actually free. It was a military measure, not a humanitarian one, at least officially. But it changed everything. The war was now explicitly about slavery. The Confederacy couldn't pretend anymore that it was about states' rights or constitutional principles. It was about preserving a society built on enslaving human beings, and enslaved people in the South understood what Lincoln had done. They fled to Union lines by the thousands. They provided intelligence. They joined the Union Army. By the end of the war, over 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had served in the Union military. The war ground on. 1863 brought Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, 3 days in July that left over 50,000 casualties. Lincoln visited the battlefield in November and gave a speech so perfect that it redefined the entire purpose of the war. The Gettysburg Address, 272 words, 2 minutes long. It reframed the Civil War as a test of whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people could survive. Because that's what was at stake. If the Confederacy won, it would prove that democracy was fragile, that any region could leave whenever it disagreed with an election, that popular sovereignty was a pleasant fiction that collapsed under pressure. The entire democratic experiment that Washington had started would be revealed as a failure. Lincoln understood this. He wasn't just fighting to keep the South in the Union. He was fighting to prove that democracy could survive its own internal contradictions, that a nation conceived in liberty could endure even when half of it was built on slavery, that people could govern themselves even when they profoundly disagreed. 1864 was a nightmare. The war seemed endless. Casualties mounted. Grant was hammering away at Lee's army in Virginia, but at terrible cost. Sherman was marching through Georgia, burning everything. The Democratic Party nominated George McClellan, Lincoln's former general, on a peace platform. McClellan would negotiate with the Confederacy. The Union would be dissolved. Slavery would continue. Lincoln was certain he would lose the election. He wrote a memo in August of 1864, sealed it, and had his cabinet sign the back without reading it. In the memo, he pledged to cooperate with the president-elect to save the Union before the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Then Sherman captured Atlanta on September 2nd. Suddenly, the war looked winnable. Lincoln won the election with 55% of the vote and carried every state except Delaware, Kentucky, and New Jersey. The soldiers in the field voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. They wanted to finish the war, not negotiate, and they did. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. The war was over. The Union was preserved. 620,000 people were dead, but the United States was still united. Lincoln had 5 days to enjoy the victory. On April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning. He was 56 years old. He'd saved the Union and ended slavery. And he didn't live to see Reconstruction or the 13th Amendment ratified or any of the complicated, messy aftermath. But here's what he did accomplish. He proved that democracy could survive civil war. That's not a small thing. Most democracies don't survive that test. They collapse into military dictatorship or permanent division. Lincoln held the country together through 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in American history, and when it was over, the United States was still a democracy. Every secessionist movement that's been defeated since then, every civil war that's ended in reunification, every democracy that's survived internal rebellion, they all owe something to Lincoln's example. He showed that it was possible, that a nation could tear itself apart and then stitch itself back together, that democracy was strong enough to endure even when tested by total war. The Emancipation Proclamation, whatever its limitations, began the process of ending slavery in America. The 13th Amendment, which Lincoln pushed through Congress in January of 1865, abolished slavery permanently. 4 million people who had been property became free. It would take another century of struggle to make that freedom meaningful, but the foundation was laid. And Lincoln did all of this while dealing with crippling depression, a difficult marriage, the death of his 11-year-old son, Willie, in 1862, and the constant knowledge that half the country wanted him dead. He wrote beautiful letters to grieving mothers. He pardoned soldiers sentenced to death for desertion or cowardice. He told jokes and stories to his cabinet to break the tension. He was melancholy and kind and ruthless and principled all at once. The world in 1865 was full of empires and monarchies. Democracy was rare. The idea that people could govern themselves was still experimental, still fragile, still suspect. If the United States had collapsed, it would have been seen as proof that democracy didn't work, that people needed kings or emperors or aristocrats to keep order. Lincoln prevented that. He saved democracy at the exact moment when it needed saving. And in doing so, he saved the world from a future where self-governance was just a failed experiment that everyone abandoned. Sleep on that. Dream of tall, sad men who carry impossible burdens and somehow find the strength to bear them anyway. It's a heavy dream, but a good one. Of course, saving democracy from internal collapse is one thing. Saving it from external annihilation is something else entirely. Franklin Roosevelt, the man who broke the empires, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Born in 1882 to a wealthy New York family, which meant he grew up with every advantage, never worried about money, attended the best schools, and developed the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. He was charming, handsome, ambitious, and seemingly headed for a pleasant career in politics where he'd accomplish moderately important things and then retire to his estate. Then in 1921, he got polio. He was 39 years old. The disease paralyzed him from the waist down. He would never walk again without assistance, and even then, it was more like lurching with leg braces and canes while someone held his arm. For the rest of his life, he would be dependent on others for the most basic physical tasks. This should have ended his political career. Politics in the 1920s required physical vigor, constant travel, handshaking, backslapping, appearing strong and vital. A man in a wheelchair was seen as weak, broken, unemployable. Roosevelt spent years trying to regain the use of his legs through various therapies and exercises. He failed, but he learned something else: resilience, the ability to endure suffering without breaking, the knowledge that you could lose everything and still find a way forward. By 1928, he was ready to try politics again. He ran for governor of New York and won. In 1932, with the Great Depression destroying the country, he ran for president against Herbert Hoover and won in a landslide. Here's what Roosevelt inherited when he took office in March of 1933. Unemployment was at 25%. Banks were failing. Farmers were losing their land. Industrial production had collapsed. People were starving. There were bread lines in every major city. The entire economic system seemed to be disintegrating, and nobody knew how to fix it. The conventional wisdom said you should balance the budget, cut spending, and wait for the market to correct itself. Roosevelt looked at this conventional wisdom and decided it was nonsense. He started spending. Federal jobs programs, infrastructure projects, financial regulations. The New Deal was a series of alphabet soup agencies, TVA, CEC, WPA, that put people to work building dams, roads, bridges, schools. It didn't end the Depression, but it kept democracy alive while the economy slowly recovered. Because that was the real danger in the 1930s. All over the world, democracies were collapsing. Germany elected Hitler in 1933. Italy already had Mussolini. Spain would fall to Franco. Japan was sliding toward militarism. The Soviet Union was Stalin's nightmare. Democracy was being seen as weak, inefficient, incapable of dealing with crisis. Fascism and communism promised strength, order, national glory. Roosevelt proved that democracy could respond to crisis without becoming a dictatorship. Yes, he expanded federal power dramatically. Yes, he packed the Supreme Court with justices who would support his programs. Yes, he won 4 terms and broke Washington's 2-term precedent. But he did it all through democratic means: elections, legislation, public support. He never suspended elections or dissolved Congress or declared martial law, and then the world caught fire. Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The United States was technically neutral, but Roosevelt knew neutrality was temporary. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He understood that America couldn't sit out a global conflict and expect to be safe. The problem was that the American public didn't want another war. The isolationists were powerful. Congressmen were deeply opposed to intervention. The Neutrality Acts prohibited selling weapons to belligerent nations. Roosevelt had to find a way to help Britain and France without technically entering the war. So he started with destroyers for bases. In September of 1940, Roosevelt gave Britain 50 old destroyers in exchange for the right to build military bases on British territory in the Western Hemisphere. This was probably illegal, or at least of questionable legality. But Roosevelt did it anyway because Britain desperately needed those destroyers to fight the U-boats that were sinking their merchant ships. Then in December of 1940, after France had fallen and Britain was standing alone against Nazi Germany, Roosevelt gave his Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat. The United States would provide Britain with weapons and supplies, not as a belligerent, but as a supporter. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he said. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. It allowed the United States to send weapons, food, and supplies to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Britain got the most aid initially, but eventually the Soviet Union would receive billions in Lend-Lease aid too. This was world-saving in real time. Britain in 1941 was hanging on by its fingernails. The Luftwaffe had tried to bomb them into submission during the Blitz. U-boats were strangling their supply lines. The British Army had been evacuated from Dunkirk and had lost most of its heavy equipment. If Britain fell, Nazi Germany would control all of Europe. The entire democratic world would consist of the United States, Canada, and a few other scattered nations. Lend-Lease kept Britain in the fight. American ships, planes, tanks, food, oil, everything Britain needed to survive, and eventually push back. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to Stalin, even though Stalin was a communist dictator who had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler 2 years earlier. Roosevelt understood that the enemy of his enemy was his temporary ally, and that a Soviet collapse would free up the entire German army to focus on Britain. Then Pearl Harbor happened, December 7th, 1941. Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Over 2,000 Americans died. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. The next day, Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. He got it, with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Suddenly, America was in a two-ocean war against the Axis powers. Roosevelt became a wartime president. He mobilized the entire economy. Factories that had been making cars started making tanks and planes. Women went to work in munitions plants. The federal government controlled production, distribution, wages, prices. The United States went from a neutral country with a small military to the greatest industrial war machine in history. And it happened in about 2 years. By 1943, the tide had turned. The Soviets were pushing the Germans back at Stalingrad. The Allies had invaded North Africa and then Italy. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, getting closer to Japan. D-Day was being planned for June of 1944. But Roosevelt was already thinking past the war. He understood that winning wasn't enough. The world after World War I had descended into economic chaos, and then another even worse war. He wanted to create a system that would prevent that from happening again. So he started building the architecture of the post-war world even before the war was over. The Atlantic Charter, signed with Winston Churchill in August of 1941, before the United States was even in the war, laid out principles for the post-war world. No territorial aggression, self-determination for all peoples, free trade, disarmament of aggressor nations. It was aspirational, but it set the tone. The Bretton Woods Conference in July of 1944 created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF would help stabilize currencies and prevent the kind of economic collapse that had led to the Great Depression. The World Bank would finance reconstruction and development. The idea was to create an interconnected economic system where countries were invested in each other's prosperity. Roosevelt also pushed for the United Nations, though he died before it was formally established. He'd seen the League of Nations fail after World War I because it had no enforcement mechanism and the United States didn't join. The UN would be different. It would have a Security Council with permanent members who could veto action, which meant the major powers would have to agree before military force could be used. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than having no forum for international cooperation at all. And Roosevelt understood that the post war world would need an alliance to counter Soviet expansion. He didn't live to see NATO created in 1949, but the groundwork was laid in the conversations he had with Churchill and Stalin at Tehran and Yalta. The idea that Western democracies would band together for mutual defense, that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. All of this, the Lend-Lease, the wartime mobilization, the post-war institutions, it was about creating a world where democracy could survive and thrive, where totalitarianism couldn't dominate, where economic catastrophe wouldn't lead to another global war. Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. He was 63 years old. He'd been president for 12 years and 1 month, longer than anyone before or since. He was exhausted, his health destroyed by the stress of leading the nation through depression and war. He had a cerebral hemorrhage while posing for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia. His last words were reportedly, "I have a terrific headache." He never saw VE Day or VJ Day. He never saw the United Nations formally established, or the Marshall Plan implemented, or NATO formed. But all of it flowed from the decisions he made and the systems he put in place. Hitler was dead. Mussolini was dead. Imperial Japan had surrendered after 2 atomic bombs. The Axis powers were utterly defeated. The most evil and powerful totalitarian empires ever assembled had been crushed, and democracy had survived. But it was a close thing. If Roosevelt hadn't pushed Lend-Lease through Congress, Britain might have fallen. If the United States hadn't mobilized its industrial capacity, the war might have dragged on for years longer. If the post-war institutions hadn't been created, Europe might have collapsed into chaos again and spawned another dictator. Roosevelt saved the world by doing what Lincoln had done. He preserved democracy when it was under existential threat. But he also did something more. He created the framework for a world where democracy could expand, where totalitarianism could be contained, where another global war could be prevented. The United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, all the alphabet soup organizations that would shape the post-war world, they all trace back to Roosevelt's vision of a world where nations cooperated instead of conquered, where economic integration created peace, where democratic values were worth defending. It's messy. The UN is often ineffective. The IMF has made terrible mistakes. NATO has been controversial. But the basic idea that the world needed institutions to prevent chaos and promote cooperation, that idea has held for nearly 80 years. We haven't had World War III. Democracy has spread instead of retreated. The post-war order that Roosevelt helped create has been the most peaceful and prosperous period in human history, at least for most of the developed world. That's world-saving on a grand scale. Not just winning a war, but creating the conditions for peace. Not just defeating totalitarianism, but building systems to prevent it from rising again. And Roosevelt did it all from a wheelchair, proving that physical disability doesn't mean weakness, that strength comes from the mind and the will, that leadership is about vision and determination, not about being able to walk. Think about that as you drift towards sleep. Think about a man who lost the use of his legs and gained the ability to reshape the world, who faced the greatest evils in human history and didn't blink, who understood that the present crisis was connected to the future peace, and who worked to build both simultaneously. It's an ambitious dream, the kind that makes you feel small and large at the same time. Small because what have you done today compared to defeating the Nazis? Large because Roosevelt was just a person, flawed and fallible and limited, who did extraordinary things because the moment demanded it. But defeating external threats is only one kind of world saving. Sometimes the threat comes from within, from contradictions so deep they threaten to unmake everything. Ronald Reagan, the actor who ended an empire with a smile, Ronald Reagan. Born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, to an alcoholic father and a devoutly religious mother, he grew up poor, worked as a lifeguard in his teens, saving 77 people from drowning in the Rock River, which is a weirdly specific number that suggests he kept count. He went to college, became a radio sports announcer, then moved to Hollywood in 1937 and spent the next few decades making movies. Not great movies, mostly. He was a solid B-list actor. His most famous role was probably playing George Gipp in Newt Rockne, All-American, where he delivered the line, "Win just one for the Gipper," which would become his political nickname 40 years later. He made training films during World War II because his eyesight was too poor for combat. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. He married Jane Wyman, divorced, then married Nancy Davis. He slowly shifted from liberal Democrat to conservative Republican as he got older and richer. By 1980, he was a two-term governor of California and the Republican nominee for president. He was 69 years old, which would make him the oldest person ever elected president up to that point. People worried he was too old, too out of touch, too simplistic. He had a habit of telling stories that weren't quite true, mixing up movies with real life, simplifying complex issues into cowboy metaphors. And then he won in a landslide over Jimmy Carter because the country was tired of malaise and gas lines and hostages in Iran. And Reagan promised morning in America with the kind of sunny optimism that made you want to believe him even when you knew better. But here's what nobody quite understood at the time. Reagan had a plan for the Soviet Union, and the plan was to break it. See, the conventional wisdom in 1981 was that the Cold War was permanent. The Soviet Union was a superpower. It had nuclear weapons, a massive military, control over Eastern Europe, and ideological influence across the Third World. The best you could hope for was détente, peaceful coexistence, managing the competition without starting World War III. Reagan thought that was nonsense. He believed the Soviet Union was fundamentally weak, economically stagnant, morally bankrupt, and vulnerable to pressure. He said so publicly, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire in a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in March of 1983. This horrified the foreign policy establishment, who thought you weren't supposed to say such things out loud. You were supposed to be diplomatic, restrained, nuanced. Reagan didn't care. He thought moral clarity was more important than diplomatic niceties. The Soviet Union was evil. It imprisoned dissidents, crushed freedom, invaded its neighbors, and claimed to represent the inevitable future of humanity. Reagan wanted to defeat it, not accommodate it. So he started spending money. The defense budget under Reagan increased by 35% in real terms between 1981 and 1985. New weapon systems, a 600-ship Navy, upgraded nuclear forces, the MX missile, the B-1 bomber, cruise missiles deployed in Europe over massive protests. The message was clear. The United States was going to outbuild, outspend, and out-innovate the Soviet Union, and there was nothing Moscow could do about it. The Soviets tried to keep up. They couldn't. Their economy was a disaster. Central planning doesn't work well for innovation. Their factories were obsolete. Their agriculture was so inefficient they had to import grain. Oil prices, their main source of hard currency, were falling. And now they had to compete with an American defense buildup they couldn't afford. But the real masterstroke was the Strategic Defense Initiative. On March 23, 1983, Reagan gave a nationally televised address from the Oval Office. He talked about the threat of nuclear weapons, the nightmare of mutually assured destruction, And then he asked, what if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant US retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? He was proposing a space-based missile defense system, satellites with lasers or particle beams that could shoot down Soviet ICBMs in flight. The media immediately called it Star Wars after the movie. Scientists said it was technically impossible. Arms control advocates said it would violate the anti-ballistic missile treaty and trigger a new arms race. Democrats mocked it as fantasy. Reagan didn't care. He genuinely believed it could work. More importantly, the Soviets believed it might work. And that terrified them. Because if the United States could build a missile defense shield that actually worked, it would negate the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal. The Soviets had spent decades and vast resources building ICBMs. If those missiles could be shot down, the Soviet Union would lose its status as a superpower. It would just be a poor country with an outdated military and a failing economy. So the Soviets had two choices. They could try to build their own SDI, which would bankrupt them, or they could try to build enough missiles to overwhelm any defense, which would also bankrupt them. Either way, they were trapped. And then Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985. Gorbachev was different from previous Soviet leaders. He was younger, 54 when he became general secretary. He was educated, articulate, and he actually understood that the Soviet system was broken. He wanted to reform it to introduce glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to reduce military spending so he could fix the economy. He wanted to end the Cold War. Reagan saw an opportunity. He'd spent 4 years building up American military power and putting pressure on the Soviet Union. Now he had a Soviet leader who was willing to negotiate. They met for the first time in Geneva in November of 1985. The Geneva summit was supposed to be a get-to-know-you session. No major agreements expected. But Reagan and Gorbachev spent hours talking, just the two of them with their interpreters. They argued about human rights, about regional conflicts, about the arms race. They didn't agree on much, but they established a personal rapport. Reagan told Gorbachev that he wasn't trying to destroy the Soviet Union, just competing with it. Gorbachev told Reagan that the arms race had to stop or it would destroy both countries. They met again in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October of 1986. This summit almost changed history. Gorbachev proposed eliminating all ballistic missiles within 10 years. Reagan countered with eliminating all nuclear weapons. They were on the verge of the most radical arms control agreement ever until Gorbachev insisted that SDI had to be confined to laboratory research. Reagan said no, he wouldn't give up SDI. The summit collapsed. People thought Reagan had made a terrible mistake. He'd had a chance to eliminate nuclear weapons, and he'd walked away because of a weapons system that didn't even exist. But Reagan understood leverage. SDI was the thing the Soviets feared most. Giving it up would have removed the pressure that was forcing them to negotiate. The next year, Gorbachev blinked. In December of 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Washington. It eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. For the first time ever, the United States and Soviet Union agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals, not just limit their growth. It included intrusive verification measures, allowing each side to inspect the other's military facilities. Reagan's phrase, "trust but verify," became famous. But the most iconic moment of the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship came earlier that year, in June of 1987, when Reagan visited West Berlin. The Berlin Wall had divided the city since 1961. It was the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain, literally a concrete barrier topped with barbed wire and guard towers where East German soldiers shot people trying to escape to freedom. Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate with the wall behind him and gave a speech. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, If you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. His speechwriters had tried to get him to remove that line. The State Department thought it was too provocative. Reagan insisted on keeping it. He delivered it with perfect timing, his voice rising with emotion. The crowd loved it. The world heard it. 2 years later, in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East Germans poured through the checkpoints. People attacked the wall with sledgehammers. The Brandenburg Gate, which had been closed for 28 years, was reopened. Reagan had left office in January of 1989, but he had lived to see it happen. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, 2 years after Reagan left office. The Communist Party lost power. The Eastern European satellites became independent. The Soviet republics declared independence. The Cold War was over. The United States had won without World War III, without nuclear weapons being used, without a direct military confrontation. Reagan's role in ending the Cold War is debated by historians. Some argue the Soviet Union would have collapsed anyway, that its economic problems were unsolvable. Others argue that Reagan's military buildup accelerated the collapse by forcing the Soviets to spend money they didn't have. Still, others argue that Gorbachev was the real hero, choosing reform over repression. The truth is probably that both men were necessary. Gorbachev was willing to reform the system, but he needed external pressure to justify it to the hardliners in the Kremlin. Reagan provided that pressure. He built up American military strength, pushed SDI, supported anti-communist movements in Poland and Afghanistan and Nicaragua, and never let Gorbachev forget that the Soviet system was morally and economically inferior. But Reagan also knew when to negotiate. He could have simply maintained pressure and waited for the Soviet Union to collapse on its own. Instead, he engaged with Gorbachev, built a relationship, and worked toward agreements that reduced the risk of nuclear war. He combined strength with diplomacy, pressure with engagement, and he did it all while maintaining his sunny, optimistic persona. He told jokes during tense meetings. He wrote personal letters to Gorbachev. He seemed genuinely to like the Soviet leader, even while competing with him. After he was shot in March of 1981, just 69 days into his presidency, he joked with the doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." He survived, recovered, and went back to work without seeming diminished or afraid. Reagan saved the world by winning the Cold War without destroying it. He understood that you could be strong without being reckless, that you could negotiate without surrendering, that moral clarity and practical diplomacy weren't mutually exclusive. The Soviet Union was an evil empire, and it needed to be defeated, but it needed to be defeated peacefully, through economic pressure and ideological competition and arms control, not through war. The result was the most peaceful end to a great power rivalry in history. No invasion, no nuclear exchange, no conventional war in Europe. Just a system that couldn't sustain itself, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, while American pressure accelerated the process. By 1989, when Reagan left office, the world was fundamentally safer than it had been in 1981. The nuclear arsenals were smaller. The risk of World War III had diminished. The Cold War was clearly ending. Democracy was spreading. The Soviet Empire was unraveling. And the former Hollywood actor who mixed up movies with reality, who believed in missile defense shields that didn't exist, who told stories that weren't quite true, had somehow managed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the Soviet Union. Think about that as your eyes get heavy. Think about a man who everyone underestimated, who seemed too simple, too old, too much of an actor, turning out to be exactly what the moment needed. Strength without aggression, optimism without naivety, the ability to see the Soviet Union as it really was, morally bankrupt and economically failing, and to push it toward collapse without starting a war. It's a gentle kind of world saving, the kind where the empire doesn't fall in a day, but slowly crumbles, where the walls come down not through violence, but through people with sledgehammers, where the greatest victory is the war that never happened. Sleep on that. Dream of walls falling and empires dissolving and the long twilight struggle ending, not with a bang, but with a whisper, with people dancing in the streets of Berlin while the guards who used to shoot them simply stood aside and let them pass. But of course, preventing nuclear war in the 1980s is one thing. Setting the stage for peaceful great power competition decades earlier is something else entirely. Theodore Roosevelt, the cowboy who stopped a war before it started. Now, let's rewind to a time when America was barely a player on the world stage, when the great powers were European or Asian, and when a former New York City police commissioner with bad eyesight and endless energy somehow became the president who proved that America could keep the peace without conquering an empire. Theodore Roosevelt, born in 1858 into a wealthy New York family, which should have meant a comfortable life of inherited wealth and polite society. Instead, he was a sickly child with severe asthma who decided to build himself into something else through sheer force of will. He boxed, he hunted, he went to Harvard and then ranched in the Dakota Territory. He wrote books, 14 of them before he turned 30. He joined the New York State Assembly, then became a federal civil service commissioner, then New York City Police Commissioner, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Roosevelt resigned his Navy position, organized a volunteer cavalry regiment called the Rough Riders, and charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba in what was basically a suicide mission that somehow worked. He became the most famous man in America overnight. New York elected him governor. 2 years later, the Republican Party put him on the ticket as William McKinley's vice president, partly to get him out of New York where he was causing trouble for the party bosses. Then, in September of 1901, an anarchist shot McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. McKinley died 8 days later. Theodore Roosevelt, at age 42, became the youngest president in American history and immediately started trying to remake American foreign policy. See, America in 1901 was powerful but isolationist. It had the largest economy in the world. It had defeated Spain and acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. It had annexed Hawaii. But it still thought of itself as separate from the great power politics of Europe and Asia. The Monroe Doctrine said European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but it didn't say anything about America getting involved in everyone else's business. Roosevelt thought that was short-sighted. He believed America needed to be an active player in world affairs, not just a regional power hiding behind two oceans. He believed in what he called the strenuous life, the idea that nations, like individuals, needed to constantly mess themselves, compete, strive, or they would decay. He also believed in four. Speak softly and carry a big stick, he said, quoting a West African proverb. Diplomacy was fine, but it only worked if you had the military strength to back it up. Peace came from strength, not from weakness or wishful thinking. So, Roosevelt started building the stick, the Great White Fleet. In 1907, Roosevelt sent 16 battleships on a voyage around the world. 14 months, 43,000 miles. They visited 6 continents. The ships were painted white, the peacetime color, which was the speak softly part, but they were state-of-the-art battleships with big guns and modern technology, which was the big stick part. The message was clear. The United States had a navy that could operate globally. American power could be projected anywhere in the world. If you wanted to challenge American interests, you'd have to think twice, because those white ships could show up on your coastline and remind you that the U.S. Navy was now one of the most powerful in the world. Japan got the message. They'd been growing increasingly powerful after their stunning victory over Russia in 1905, and there was tension over Japanese immigration to California and American control of the Philippines. The Great White Fleet's visit to Japan was both a gesture of friendship and a quiet reminder: don't push too hard. But the real world-saving moment came earlier, in 1905, when Roosevelt mediated the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Here's the context. Japan and Russia had gone to war in February of 1904 over control of Manchuria and Korea. Everyone expected Russia to win. Russia was huge, with a massive army and European prestige. Japan was small, Asian, and had only recently modernized. The smart money was on Russia, crushing Japan, and then expanding further into East Asia. Instead, Japan won. Repeatedly. They destroyed the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. They defeated the Russian army at Mukden. Then in May of 1905, in the Battle of Tsushima Strait, the Japanese Navy utterly annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world only to be sunk in a single day of combat. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history. But both sides were exhausted. Japan had won the battles but was running out of money and manpower. Russia had lost the battles but still had resources and could continue the war if it wanted to. Neither side wanted to be the first to ask for peace, because that would look weak. Roosevelt saw an opportunity and a danger. The opportunity was to position America as a mediator, to show that the United States could play a role in great power politics. The danger was that if the war continued, it might escalate. Other powers might get involved. China might collapse into complete chaos. The whole balance of power in East Asia could shift in unpredictable ways. So Roosevelt offered to mediate. Both sides agreed, probably because neither wanted to admit they needed peace. The Portsmouth Conference took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in August of 1905. Roosevelt didn't attend the conference himself. He stayed in Oyster Bay, New York, and managed the negotiations through telegrams and messages. But he was deeply involved in every detail. He pressured both sides. He cajoled. He threatened. He used his relationship with the Kaiser of Germany to put pressure on Russia. He used American public opinion, which was pro-Japan, to pressure both sides to reach an agreement. The sticking points were brutal. Russia didn't want to pay an indemnity. Japan demanded one. Russia didn't want to give up Sakhalin Island. Japan insisted on taking at least the southern half. Both sides were prepared to walk away rather than look weak. Roosevelt worked both sides. He told Japan that continuing the war would bankrupt them and that American public opinion would turn against them if they seemed too greedy. He told Russia that losing to Japan again would be humiliating and might lead to revolution at home. He split the difference on Sakhalin, giving the southern half to Japan and letting Russia keep the north. He convinced Japan to drop the demand for an indemnity in exchange for Russian recognition of Japanese interests in Korea. On September 5, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. The war was over. Japan got Korea and the Liaodong Peninsula. Russia kept most of Siberia and didn't have to pay reparations. Neither side was happy, which probably meant it was a fair deal. Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, the first American to receive it. He didn't attend the ceremony because he was busy being president. He donated the prize money to charity. But the real significance wasn't the prize. It was what the treaty prevented. If the war had continued, it might have spread. Britain had an alliance with Japan. France had an alliance with Russia. Germany was looking for opportunities to expand its influence. China was weak and vulnerable. The whole situation could have escalated into something much larger, possibly a precursor to World War I a decade earlier, in Asia instead of Europe. Roosevelt prevented that. He showed that diplomacy could work. that great powers could settle their differences without either side being humiliated, that a third party could mediate successfully if it had enough credibility and leverage, and he did it while also building American power. The Great White Fleet, the Panama Canal, which Roosevelt pushed through over massive obstacles and which he later admitted he took from Colombia in a way that was legally questionable but strategically brilliant. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said the United States would intervene in Latin America to prevent European intervention, basically making the US the regional hegemon. Roosevelt created what would later be called Pax Americana, the American peace. The idea that American power, properly applied, could maintain stability and prevent great power wars, not through conquest or empire in the old European sense, but through strength, diplomacy, and the willingness to get involved when necessary. It wasn't perfect. Roosevelt's interventions in Latin America were often heavy-handed and created resentment. His views on race and empire were typical of his time, which means they were offensive by modern standards. He believed in American and Anglo-Saxon superiority in ways that make modern readers cringe, but he also believed in fairness, in what he called the square deal. He broke up monopolies. He pushed for conservation, creating national parks and forests. He regulated food and drugs. He believed that power should be used for the common good, not just for the benefit of the powerful. And in foreign policy, he understood something crucial. Peace doesn't come from weakness or isolation. It comes from strength combined with the willingness to negotiate. You build the big stick so you don't have to use it. You demonstrate your power so that others know not to challenge you. But you also engage in diplomacy, mediate disputes, and work towards stability. The Russo-Japanese War mediation was Roosevelt testing this theory. Could the United States, a nation that had been isolationist for most of its history, successfully mediate a war between two great powers on the other side of the world? Could American credibility and leverage be enough to bring both sides to the table and keep them there until they reached an agreement? The answer was yes, and that answer echoed through the 20th century. When America entered World War I, it positioned itself as a mediator, though the Versailles Treaty was far less successful than Portsmouth. When America rebuilt Europe after World War II, it was using the same basic principle. American power, properly applied, could create stability and prevent war. Roosevelt died in 1919, just after World War I ended. He'd been out of the presidency for a decade. He'd tried to run again in 1912 as a third-party candidate and split the Republican vote, giving the election to Woodrow Wilson. He'd been disappointed, angry, full of the same frenetic energy he'd always had. But his legacy was the idea that America could be a force for peace through strength, that great power competition didn't have to mean great power war, that mediation and diplomacy could work if backed by credible military force, that speaking softly worked better when everyone knew about the big stick. Think about that as you sink deeper into your pillow. Think about a man who was too energetic to sleep, who read books compulsively, who hunted big game and wrote histories and built a navy and mediated a war, all because he believed that life should be strenuous, challenging, meaningful. He saved the world by preventing a war from spreading, by showing that American power could be used for stability rather than conquest, by establishing the pattern that would define American foreign policy for the next century. And he did it while also being, improbably, a cowboy, a police commissioner, a naturalist, a historian, and the most energetic president in American history. It's an exhausting dream, the kind that makes you tired just thinking about it, but it's also inspiring in its own manic way. A reminder that sometimes saving the world just means getting involved, showing up, using whatever power you have to prevent something worse from happening. Sleep on that. dream of white ships sailing around the world, of peace treaties signed in quiet New Hampshire towns, of presidents who believed that the strenuous life meant serving something larger than yourself, no matter how much energy it took. But preventing wars between great powers is one kind of world saving. Sometimes the threat isn't external conquest, but internal poison, the kind that spreads through a nation's soul and threatens to corrupt everything. John Kennedy, the 13 days when the world almost ended, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Born in 1917 to a wealthy Massachusetts family, the second of 9 children, which meant he grew up in controlled chaos with enough money to make it bearable. His father was a ruthless businessman and politician who wanted one of his sons to be president. The oldest son, Joe Jr., was supposed to be that son. But Joe died in World War II when his bomber exploded over the English Channel during a volunteer mission. So the pressure fell to Jack, who didn't particularly want to be president, but was good at it anyway in that effortless way that comes from privilege and charisma. He served in the Navy during World War II, commanded a PT boat that got cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, saved most of his crew, and became a war hero despite the fact that getting your boat cut in half is not usually considered excellent seamanship. He came home with a bad back that would plague him for the rest of his life, requiring constant pain medication and a rocking chair that became iconic. He went into politics because that's what his father wanted. Congressman, then senator, then in 1960, president, defeating Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history. Kennedy was 43 when he took office in January of 1961, the youngest elected president ever. He gave an inaugural address that's still quoted today. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. He projected youth, vigor, intelligence, confidence. He had a beautiful wife and young children. He made the presidency seem glamorous in a way it hadn't been since the days of Theodore Roosevelt. And then he immediately started making mistakes. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961 was a disaster. CIA-trained Cuban exiles invaded Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. Kennedy had inherited the plan from Eisenhower, but approved it anyway. The invasion failed completely. The exiles were killed or captured. Kennedy looked weak and inexperienced. Castro looked strong. And the Soviet Union, which was supporting Castro, learned that the young American president could be pushed. So Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to push. In the summer of 1962, the Soviets started secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could hit most of the United States in minutes. No warning time, no chance to respond. Just instant annihilation for tens of millions of Americans. The Soviets had good reasons for this, from their perspective. The United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet border. The US had a massive nuclear advantage overall. Cuba was a Soviet ally that needed protection, and Khrushchev thought Kennedy was weak after the Bay of Pigs and wouldn't respond strongly. On October 16, 1962, a U-2 spy plane brought back photographs of Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. Kennedy was informed that morning. He immediately assembled a group of advisors that became known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For the next 13 days, they would meet constantly, sometimes multiple times a day, trying to figure out how to respond without starting World War III. The options were all terrible. You could invade Cuba, which would kill Americans and Soviets and probably trigger a Soviet response in Berlin or Turkey. You could bomb the missile sites, which might not destroy all the missiles and would definitely kill Soviet personnel. You could do nothing, which would make the United States look weak and give the Soviets a permanent nuclear advantage. Or you could try some kind of middle option, like a blockade, which might or might not work and might trigger a confrontation at sea. The military brass wanted to bomb. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were nearly unanimous. Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, who would run the firebombing campaign against Japan in World War II, basically called Kennedy a coward for not immediately attacking. LeMay said the Soviet missiles in Cuba didn't fundamentally change the strategic balance because the Soviets already had ICBMs that could hit the US. Kennedy responded that it might not change the strategic balance, but it sure changed the political balance, and also LeMay might be underestimating how many people would die. Kennedy chose the blockade. Except he called it a quarantine because a blockade is technically an act of war, and he wanted to leave room for diplomacy. On October 22nd, he went on national television and told the American public what was happening. Soviet missiles in Cuba. American response would be a naval quarantine. Any ship carrying offensive weapons would be turned back. Any missile launched from Cuba would be considered a Soviet attack requiring full retaliation against the Soviet Union. It was the scariest speech an American president has ever given. People watched and wondered if they would be alive in a week. Schools ran nuclear drills. Families stocked bomb shelters. The military went to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war, the highest alert level in American history. Soviet ships were already heading toward Cuba. American warships formed a line in the Atlantic. The question was, would the Soviet ships stop or would they try to run the blockade? If they tried to run it, American ships would have to stop them. That would mean a confrontation, possibly shooting. And once shooting started between American and Soviet forces, escalation to nuclear war became very likely, very quickly. On the morning of October 24th, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American destroyers prepared to intercept. Kennedy and his advisors waited in the White House, watching updates come in. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." The Soviet ships stopped. Some turned around. The ones that continued were carrying non-military cargo and allowed themselves to be inspected. The immediate crisis of confrontation at sea was avoided, but the missiles were still in Cuba. And they were becoming operational. The CIA estimated that some would be ready to fire within days. Kennedy had to get them out before they became permanent. Back-channel negotiations started. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, met secretly with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The message was, remove the missiles and the U.S. won't invade Cuba. There was also a secret promise. The U.S. would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but this couldn't be public or look like a trade. Meanwhile, Castro was getting more aggressive. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba on October 27th, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. The military pressure on Kennedy to retaliate intensified. LeMay and the other chiefs wanted immediate airstrikes. Kennedy held off, believing there was still a chance for a diplomatic solution. That same day, Khrushchev sent 2 letters. The first, more conciliatory, suggested removing the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The second, more aggressive, demanded that the U.S. remove its missiles from Turkey. Kennedy decided to respond to the first letter and ignore the second, a strategy suggested by his advisors. He publicly accepted the deal. Missiles out of Cuba, no invasion of Cuba. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the brink. We know now how close it actually was. There were more nuclear weapons in Cuba than the Americans knew about, including tactical nuclear weapons that local Soviet commanders had authority to use. If the U.S. had invaded, those weapons might have been deployed. Soviet submarines near the quarantine line carried nuclear torpedoes. One submarine commander considered using his, but was talked out of it by another officer. The world was saved by individual decisions not to launch, by people who chose restraint when they had authorization for escalation. Kennedy had navigated the crisis by being firm, but not aggressive, by leaving Khrushchev room to back down without complete humiliation, by ignoring the military advice to attack immediately. He'd kept communication open. He'd thought several moves ahead. He'd understood that winning meant both sides surviving, not one side destroying the other. In the aftermath, both sides realized how close they had come to disaster. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established in 1963, a direct communication link so the leaders could talk immediately during a crisis instead of waiting for messages to be delivered through diplomatic channels. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in August of 1963, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It was the first arms control treaty of the nuclear age, a small step toward managing the madness of mutually assured destruction. Kennedy gave a speech at American University in June of 1963, calling for a re-examination of Cold War attitudes. If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity, he said. It was a vision of coexistence, of competition without annihilation. 5 months later, he was dead, shot in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. He was 46 years old. He'd been president for less than 3 years, but in those 3 years, he'd faced down the closest approach to nuclear war in history and found a way through it that didn't involve the end of civilization. Think about that as you finally let go and drift into sleep. Think about 13 days in October when every decision mattered, when one wrong move could have killed hundreds of millions of people, when the fate of the world rested on the ability of two men who didn't trust each other to find a way to step back from the edge. Kennedy saved the world by not ending it, by choosing the quarantine over the airstrike, by responding to the conciliatory letter instead of the aggressive one, by giving Khrushchev a way to retreat without losing too much face. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is not do the thing everyone is pressuring you to do. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the presidents who saved the world. 7 men. 7 moments when everything could have gone wrong. When democracy could have collapsed, when nuclear weapons could have been launched, when empires could have conquered, when the whole fragile experiment of human self-governance could have been revealed as nothing more than a temporary aberration in history's long march toward tyranny, but it didn't happen. Because at the crucial moment, someone made the right call. A haberdasher authorized nuclear weapons and then went home to play piano. A general refused to become king and planted trees instead. A lawyer held a nation together through its bloodiest war. A man in a wheelchair broke the most evil empires in history. An actor smiled and bankrupted the Soviet Union. A cowboy mediated a war on the other side of the world. And a young president with a bad back stared down nuclear annihilation and blinked last. They were flawed, all of them. They made mistakes. They held views we'd find offensive today. They weren't saints or superheroes. They were just people who happened to be in the right place at the right time, and who somehow found within themselves the strength to do what needed to be done. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful that when the world was ending, somebody had the presence of mind to stop it. And remember, if a haberdasher from Missouri can save Western civilization in his spare time, you can probably handle whatever's on your to-do list tomorrow. Sleep tight. The world's still here because someone somewhere made the boring choice to not destroy it. Sweet dreams.